Remember that the POST stands for Power On Self-Test, and it's something that your BIOS does when your computer starts up. But what if you can't see anything on the screen? Well, if you can't, you're going to want to use some type of POST tester. And we're going to show how to use a POST card tester, but you don't see these that often anymore for PCI Express. However, some motherboards include a POST tester, and we'll show that on the motherboard within the AV editor computer. So let's get started. Let's talk about POST devices. The POST is the Power On Self-Test, and we know that the motherboard does this, the BIOS or your UEFI does this, and it checks all your devices. Now, what's great about the POST is if there's a problem, you might get a beep code, you might see an indicator light in here, you might get a message on the screen. But what if you don't get any of those things and you're not sure what the problem is? Well, then you can use a POST device, a POST tester, to find out what the problem is, which is quite often one of the big four that we talked about: CPU, RAM, motherboard, or video card. And there's various types of POST devices. Back in the day, you'd use a card, and the card would be a PCI card. And you'd connect the card, then boot up the system, and read the, there would be a readout with a two-digit display, and you'd find out what the code means within a book or online documentation or what have you. Nowadays, you don't have PCI slots as much anymore, and you're going to be hard-pressed to find a PCI Express POST card. You might find one, you might find a USB tester, but I got to be honest with you, they're generally not necessary. I've used the POST testers in the past, maybe once out of every 50 computers that I worked on. And with the newer UEFI, it's not as necessary, to be honest with you. But the best types of POST device is the one that's built into the motherboard. And that's one of the reasons I chose this motherboard, because it has a built-in POST tester, and the two-digit code is right here. So when you boot the computer, it'll run through a series of codes, and it'll stop if there's an error. So everything is connected now. I connected everything back up from the previous lessons. And so we're going to boot the system now. And you can see the various codes it's going through. It's testing everything. And generally with these POST testers, if it ends at 00 or FF, you're in good shape, and that means that the system has booted properly. And for this device, AA is also okay. That's a special code, and that's actually all right. Now, if you want to learn more about the codes for your POST tester, you want to look at the documentation. And so that might come with a book if it's an external POST tester, or if it's, say, an external USB or an internal PCI POST tester. And it might come in the book, the manufacturer's documentation with the motherboard. And this motherboard is from Asus, and these are known as Q codes. That's what they call them. So there's a whole ton of them, a whole different list of problems that could occur. But the AA is okay, and the system will boot all right if it's set on AA. Now, there's a lot of other possibilities, obviously. You saw there's probably dozens there. So I'm going to shut down the computer and pull a stick of RAM and then reboot and see what error message we get. Okay, so always make sure that the little LED light on the motherboard has turned off before you touch anything inside the system. And so I have removed all of the RAM sticks, and so now we'll power the device back, power the computer back up. Okay, and it goes through a couple codes, and right away it stops at the 53 code. Now this is hexadecimal, by the way, so you can have a lot of different options here. You might see numbers or letters. And if we were to look at our manufacturer's documentation here, we'd see down here 50 through 53 is a memory initialization error. Invalid memory, incompatible memory, or in this case, no memory. That's what we have in this case. So you can look up what's happening, and these codes are usually right. If you have an issue with incompatible memory, or if you have two sticks that are not the same, two different speeds, or they're in the wrong slots, you usually get a 50 through a 53 code. So I'm going to fix that right now. We'll shut down the system. And it hasn't even booted properly because there is no memory in there. Wait for that LED to go out. And I'll put the RAM back in and boot it back up. Okay, so I put the RAM back in, and always be sure to use your documentation. You want to know where your RAM is supposed to go. If you're using dual channel or tri-channel or quad channel, there's going to be a whole diagram and then description of what the slots are. So make sure you're putting them in the correct location. And so we'll boot this guy back up. Let that guy run through. And again, usually this is a problem with connections, or a device isn't there, it's missing, or it's incompatible. And usually you can find these things with your eyes. You can find out what the problem is generally. But here we go. AA is the code. Everything's good. That's how this normally boots. And we're in good shape. So now we can use the system to our heart's delight. So that's post testing. And this is outside of what the BIOS or UEFI does for you. This is beyond that. So it's diagnostics in the case that you can't see anything on the screen and you don't hear anything on the computer. And again, older devices, you could use a PCI version. Again, I rarely use that. Maybe 1 out of every 50 computers. And you might see a PCI Express or a mini card version or a USB version, but the best ones are the ones that are built into the motherboard. But they all work essentially the same. It's a 2-digit code, and you have to cross-reference that to your documentation to find out what the error is. But keep in mind, if you see something like AA or 00 or FF, generally that means the system's booting properly, and you want to look elsewhere for the problem. And so that's it for this sub lesson.